problem. I'm going to start on time just to make sure that we have enough time for Andrew to get through his presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce Andrew Mowat to you. Is it Mowat or?
Mowat.
Mowat, okay. So Andrew is not going to get the award for the furthest travel to come to the conference because he works here. Just his little biography, he began his career as a teacher in 1984 and progressed through school leadership to eventually become a coach, a trainer, a facilitator, and a consultant to schools in Australia, England, and Canada. Hi everybody. There's chairs coming. This front row. Andrew has refined his engagement skills around leadership, neuroscience, and ICT, and his extensive coaching and facilitation heritage strongly influenced both his style and methodology. He has a passion for converting theory and forward thinking into real-world application. Andrew published his first book, The Success Zone, in 2009, drawing from neuroscience, coaching, and personal leadership, with application to diverse fields including teacher and leader and development and student well-being. Would you please welcome Andrew Mowat?
Thanks, Adrian. A little bit like Sean, and I'm sort of happy that Sean's here, and hopefully the technology will fail me as well, and therefore I'm on an equal level as everyone else today. We've had a couple of little hiccups, but I'm an interesting beast in that I'm here on an IT basis, but I've got a very strong interest in engagement and the things that drive engagement from a neuroscience point of view. And as an opening line here, it fascinates me that in education we're acting on ultimately the brain, yet we do nothing in training to actually help teachers understand the functional aspect of what's going on when we teach. It's a bit like, we talk about brain-based learning, it's a bit like saying will-based driving. It's just such an obvious thing that we don't learn in our feet, although you could argue you learn in the whole body. But so hence part of one of my soapboxes in life is to help people understand. There's a couple of models that I've built in collaboration with a couple of other friends before I returned back to schools. I'm enjoying back being in a collaborative sense in this sort of setting. So with that, I'll push on, and this will be too much for 30 minutes, so there's stuff that I'll skip over. But again, the process of iTunes U means you can engage with the content a little bit further later on. One of the things that I was playing with doing, and the why this slide was here, was to actually take a few moments to dip you out of the deep cognitive engagement that you've been happening so far today, because in fact any structure like today, and this is parallel to a school, is not brain friendly. You're coming from one content presentation where you've got some interesting ideas, and you're being asked to park that and then rework something that's completely new. And in the brain likes to take some time to process and engineer synapses that join together. The best way to get that organised is to be presented with some new stuff and then go and talk to someone about what you've seen. That works particularly well. Yet when you come from one place to another and you're presented with new content, what happens is that the engineering of the new synapses is nowhere near as efficient. So you start to lose some stuff. And it's the way we drive schools. It's the way conferences have to be organised often. But you think about going from maths to English, the same brain dissonance that's going on. So I was going to start with some meditation, literally quiet, listening to breathing, listening to the sounds, and listening to music. But with 30 minutes, that soaks up some of the content. But I will talk about the importance of mindfulness, though, in your ability, and referencing Sean's work, I'll do this constantly after having seen what he was talking about, the ability to be able to stay in a creative and calm frame of mind. I've seen two examples of staying calm under pressure today, both because technology is triggering some frustration, and you'll see what's going on in the brain when we do that. So today, probably too much to cover, but we'll give you, if I can get you to walk away with a sense of wanting to explore more of the neuroscience, and there's more and more impacting on the educational sphere. I'll post some more resources into this space because literally, fortunately now, educational neuroscience and in behavioural neuroscience, they're the two key areas. There's a lot of big stuff coming through. I really want to spend some time on some mind zone stuff and how we experience reality through two different circuits. And once you understand that, that will change how you listen to people, or give you an understanding how you can change the way you listen to people. And if there's one thing I can give you to walk away with, if you can re-engineer the way you listen to people, you can become transformative in your role rather than transactional. And that's a key piece I work on. A couple of other bits if we get to them. If we don't, there are resources to look at. So I've got some reminders up on the top right-hand side, but there's an old model of the brain here where, and a word of caution, the brain is the most complex thing known to man. Think about schools, it's a collection of the most complex thing known to man. So is it any wonder that they're difficult places in which to work, any organisation? So this model is an old model, and it will fall down at some point. So just be aware that any model of the brain that we've got won't satisfy some things. But this is useful from a certain point of view. Reptilian brain, lowest level of evolutionary development in the brain, very, very, very efficient, and it's built around survival. So that's the part of the brain that when you step out in front of a bus and it automatically, before you think, pulls you back if you see what's happening, you're not thinking about that. In fact, if you were thinking about it, the bus would run you over. So this is a very essential part of the brain. It's where a lot of your habits live, not all of them. Some of the habits that you have are in the large purple area called the cerebellum, and your brainstem, automatic things like heartbeat, breathing. If you have a diving accident and you damage this part of the brain, it's likely that you'll die. So this is a critical survival mechanism of the brain. This is the middle part of the brain. So if you imagine you've got a fist and you roll over the top, a layer, that middle layer is the mammalian brain, often referred to the mammalian brain because it's where, it's the part of the brain that mammals have as opposed to reptiles and birds. And that's why they're named as such. And this is a critical part of the brain for us, and this is the most active part of the brain in kids and in adolescents. The large sort of loopy purple thing is the hippocampus, and that's largely where short-term memory is converted to long-term memory, but it's largely where you remember stuff, but not, you do stuff all over the brain. So when I say that's largely where you remember stuff, there's other places in all sorts of places. So when you do something, it's a network of things that are working at any one time. It's never one spot that's working. But largely that's what's going on. Emotional memory, that little blue dot that's just here, that's a critical bit for us to know in working with kids. It's the amygdala. You have two of them. And the amygdala works in concert with the reptilian brain. You know when you're walking on the street at night, you hear footsteps behind you and the hair starts to stand at the back of your neck? That's your, what I'm going to call the red zone. That's your survival mechanism. That's your fear-based, threat-based alert system. It says, prepare for danger because something is worrying me. Sean mentioned before, you cannot be creative when you're fearful, and this model will explain why, in fact, that is the case, and why, in fact, we need to move away from this. Education versions 1 and 2, particularly version 1, which was the Victorian era, was all about activating these two parts of the brain to control people, and still to some degree in the 40s to 80s version or the 40s to 2000s version of education. Very quickly, the top part of the brain, the human sensing part of the brain, I've called it, the thinking brain, sensing thinking brain rather than the feeling remembering brain in the middle, is this massive bit of architecture that we have that sits over the top from the back forward. If you imagine a 1 metre by 1 metre tablecloth and you scrunch that up and you fold that up and place that on top, that's effectively what this cortical part of the brain is. It's very thin, but it's been wrapped up into the usual sort of wrinkles. It's never more than about 3 to 5 millimetres thick at its thickest point. So it's a massively, and this is because this is folded because you can pack a lot of stuff into that particular place. Now the interesting thing is that's very inefficient. So what I've got up the left-hand side here is the metabolic cost of running these parts of the brain, and the conscious awareness or control along the right. So in other words, low conscious awareness, very, very cheap to run. Increasing a little bit here, these two parts of the brain run like you wouldn't believe. They run probably 90% of your brain activity is subconscious. When you see a pair of shoes, or if I see a bright shiny object and you see that in the shop and you say, I want to buy it, and then you start saying to yourself, do you know what? That's on sale at the moment. If I get that, all that justification stuff, the decision's already been made. Forget the justification. There's a book that says, it's called How We Decide by Jonah Lehrer. Very interesting. The decision's already done. 95% of your decision making is here. Then it flows through into consciousness and you start justifying. So this is a very important part of the brain. It's where we have creativity, collaboration, confidence, all of those things that we're really speaking about in our modern version of education that we're speaking to. All of the stuff that Sean was referencing before is actually happening, particularly if you get your hand and go smack there, pretty well every bit of it's there. Self-identity is here. Self-esteem, if you like, sits in this part. Who we are as humans just sits behind your forehead. And we know this because of accidents that people have gone through. Famous case of Phineas Gage in 18-something. A railway bolt went through there and out through here, and his whole personality changed. He was a different person. In the 30s, if you're a little bit weird and wacky, I reckon I would have been subjected to this. They poked a needle up through there, and they went squish, 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 and completely mushed up the prefrontal cortex to control people who were just a little bit weird. So that's what a lobotomy is. So that's a critical part of the brain. The model that in conjunction with a guy that I worked with called John Corrigan, and he still works in schools in Melbourne as a coach consultant and in sort of creating cultures, learning cultures in schools. We came up with this concept called the red zone and the blue zone. So the red zone is the interaction, if you like, and it's a simple concept, the interaction of the mammalian and reptilian brains. So it's survival based, and I'll give you some descriptors of what that looks like. You'll all know it well, we've all got them. I've got my red zone. Kids are born with an active red zone. It's actually operating at the time that they're born. The top one, you can see the blue zone is the combination of your thinking and conscious brain with your feeling, remembering brain. So in other words, in the blue zone, it's not about happy, sad, good versus evil. It's me being in a state where I'm aware. It's like being metacognitive. Metacognition is very blue zone. So for instance, I can say that I'm not in a good state of mind at the moment, and I can adjust my behaviour to suit accordingly. If I'm in the red zone, I've got no idea that I'm really crappy to get along with, and I'll just behave badly because I don't have that ability to A, be aware, or C, make a choice. So it's all about me. 2-year-old tantrum, classic case of a red zone, if you like. Someone who, blue zone, we've seen, I'm referencing Sean staying calm under the pressure when that's blue zone. So he knows stuff's going on, he knows he needs to engage. Same with the presentation first thing this morning. That's the simple model. A couple of other quick things to layer on this before I move through into the next piece. First of all, emotions are contagious. Blue zone is contagious, but it's more difficult to catch a blue zone of someone. Red zone is very, very, very contagious. So if you walk into a classroom as a teacher, and the very fact that you're here, none of you who do this, but if I looked at Craig, and I know Craig at the back, and I said, what are you, I did the usual thing, you idiot, get out of my classroom. So I exert a lot of anger and judgment and demeanment of a particular student, the old style of teaching, you get out, then everyone who witnesses that sees, actually starts to move more in the red zone. Second concept that I'll join that with is that we have limited resources. A zero-sum economy in the brain. So that means if I activate the red zone, it's at the expense of the blue zone. So those two things together mean that in one fell swoop, I've actually reduced the learning, collaboration, creative, self-control capacity of everyone in the classroom who sees that. So a leader at the front who is calm, engaging, connected is critical to drive the blood flow, because this is a blood flow situation. If I activate your red zones now, if I do something that's weird and you don't know what I'm doing, or if I start to demean someone and you don't like what I'm doing, I will be driving your brain response down into these spaces. This is where judgment and blame sits. So you'll start to judge me and you'll start to say, what an idiot. What the hell's he doing? So you literally drive it. What do you do when someone cuts you off in a car? You say, hi, that was okay, look, I'll deal with that. You look at them, you focus in on them, and you look at their number plate and you track them as if they're in the traffic, don't you? And it's all about me. I want you to know how upset I am. So you move, other people can move you into that space. The other basic thing about the brain, below conscious, and I'm sorry that this is the majority part of your brain, it's doing two things all of the time: avoiding pain or seeking reward. So I can guarantee you, if I said the next activity is I'm going to point at someone, you're going to come up and I'm going to give you a song to sing in front of everyone, you will all look at the floor, go and hide under it. That's avoiding pain. So very quickly your brain will be into mostly avoiding pain. So avoiding pain, if I trigger that part of your brain, it's really more into this red zone space. If you're seeking reward, you could argue, the model starts to fall down a bit, but you're starting to move into this blue zone space. So before I move on to the next slide, that's a big concept. We're going to not have much time to talk about it, but I want you to turn to the person next to you and just tell them one thing that stuck out that that is a new thought or something that you're connecting in your brain. So I just want you to talk about this blue zone, red zone concept. What's something that is in your mind now that you've heard this? 1 minute only.
Which
I got a little cuss.
Okay, everyone, just hold it there. I've not given you enough time because of the compressed time we have, and the very fact that people want to keep talking is a good thing, and the more this sort of thing gets presented to people, the harder it is in the longer versions of this that I do, the harder it is to break people's attention. So that's one little trick that I've learnt from a number of sources, particularly a guy called John Medina, and he has a wonderful book called Brain Rules and Brain Rules for Baby. Even though it says Brain Rules for Baby, every educator should read it. And he's a university lecturer that drives very engaging sessions. He's got very boring subject matter, you could argue. That's being judgmental. But that's a key. You've got to talk about what you're learning, and you've got to give, if you sit there for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, he talks about a 5 to 10 minute window of transaction where I'm transacting attention with you. And I'm convincing you you should pay attention to me, and after about 10 minutes, your brain starts to say, do you know what, I'm just not going to. So that's one little piece, and good teachers do this all the time. Think, Share, Pair is a perfect example of that. So that's actually speaking well to the neuroscience. That zone of mindfulness, I'll just quick rebuild here. That zone of mindfulness on the right-hand side, by the way, the blue zone is highly taxing on the metabolic demands of your system. So if you are a teacher who spends every day in front of a class, engaged with people, listening deeply, then you should walk away feeling tired. And you will, because of the brain uses 20% of the body's energy budget for 2 to 3% of its weight. In fact, people are starting to say now it's 25%. A quarter of your energy is running this thing. If you start doing stuff that's inefficient for the brain, it's using quite a lot of energy. So you will feel tired later on. However, the interesting thing is if you go into a mindful state, and mindfulness is actually using your conscious awareness in a state that connects with your subconscious, and this could be meditation, it could be a variety of things, it could be sitting quietly, it could be reading a book, watching a movie, whatever you do to get, you actually are highly aware often, but your metabolic demands actually drop. This is one of the reasons why people love that sort of exercise. And I'll share with you at the end a couple of things that I do that keep me in what is a reasonably demanding job, keep me in a relatively calm space of mind every day.
About 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Yeah.
Whoa. Okay, let's scoot through. Very quickly, defining the red zone and blue zone. Thank you for that. That's really good. Red zone is simply, it's about me, low awareness, low choice, effectively, reduced options. Blue zone is much more about, it's about us. High awareness, increased options. So it's not necessarily happy. You can be in the red zone and be in a happy state that has no awareness of the impact of others. In fact, a lot of people who get old who start to think they need to do something like get a car and get a younger wife and all those sorts of things, you know, that's actually at the expense of not being aware of those choices. You can be in the blue zone and still be pretty peed off about things, but you can be managing that down and working with it. So be aware that that's what the key is. This is a quick slide to show that over the journey of a life, over age, the kids that we're dealing with actually don't start to engage and build a blue zone capacity. Their prefrontal cortex doesn't start to develop to the point until they're about 8 to 10 to 12. And as they start to get older, the impact of behaviour on me from someone else and my behaviour on them starts to become a consciously aware little circuitry. And they can start to learn, often by modelling, that they can drop down their red zone response. Not everyone gets to experience that in life, though. Some people are outstanding. This guy that I mentioned before, John Corrigan, that I've worked with, he's got virtually no red zone. I've never seen him. I've got one, but he hasn't. I'm very jealous. So he's actually been able to work through and manage it down. Here's the news. The more you manage down your red zone, it's like a muscle. The more you flex that capacity, the smaller the parts of the brain that drive your red zone actually become, and you start to increase the parts of the brain, or the not so much physically increase. By increase I mean the number of physical connections that join them. The brain works on use it or lose it. So therefore, the more you activate the red zone, the more you're building connections to make sure it runs that way. The more you actually use your red zone, it becomes a cycle. Same in reverse. So the more you practice calm under pressure in a variety of formats, the more you'll find that. Every one of us here knows that we have people like this. Their blue zone's more of a purple zone. It's never really present. And they're very, very difficult people to be around, and they become red zone people in life. They're adults that use red zone being an immature brain response. They carry that through and they mask it. So there are forms of bullying, sulking, withdrawal that we see that become more complex because they've got adult flavours to them. But at the end of the day, you strip away the layers, they are still sulking or bullying, or those sorts of the tantrums. You see someone who throws a tantrum that's quite controlled, but it's still a tantrum. So let me pass straight through. This is an important piece. And like I said, if I can give you an understanding of this and the impact of listening and the elements, I'll flick through the other slides very quickly. But this is an important one for you to understand. This is neuroscientifically researched, so this is not some left brain, right brain stuff, which is one of my pet myths that I love to go on, because left brain, right brain, I have to say, is very inaccurate, but useful but inaccurate. So it turns out there are two ways of experiencing life as we see it. Most often, we're on this side of the brain. We are using what we call our narrative circuits. Now, it's not a side, it's just a circuit in your brain. So when we experience things, we think in words. So if you're having a beer, feet in tropical water, palm trees everywhere, and you think to yourself, oh, I wish the guys from work here, you're in your narrative brain. And we are so dominant in this narrative brain that we think all of the time. But that happens at the expense of this other part of the brain, which is all connected to the senses. I thought about rewriting this as the sensual brain, and it really is, because that's connected to senses, but people would misinterpret that and would probably go into the red zone. But it's all about observation, and that's the key. When you observe rather than... So right at the moment I'm observing all of you, and I can see which ones of you are more or less engaged, or the ones that are really connected with it, and there are some of you that are... And that's fine, that's just an observation, there's no judgment in that. It's also about reflection when we reflect on things. It's all about perception, presence. Sean was wonderful before as a presenter because he was present with you. So presence is actually being with you at that time. Great teachers, great individuals you love being with, people who have charisma actually are nothing more than just being present with you. You often hear the statement, he made me feel like I was the only person in the room. Presence. Intuition and environmental focus, that sense of I'm aware of me, I'm aware of you, I'm aware of other things that are going on. So the narrative brain, which is the other dominant part of the brain, is about judgments, finding solution, interpretation, meaning. I need to understand what's happening. I actually, the Covey's rules, seek first to understand. You can take that one step further and be much more powerful. You just seek to observe and don't try and understand, because in fact for the other person, what they need from you is not a solution, but in fact just to be there for them. And all the magic happens in their brain. So that's a very important piece, because that drives the listening. Most of us listen, and you can see the bias there. The narrative brain is more of a red zone bias. Doesn't mean you be in your red zone, but it's easy to go that way. Very much direct as in your blue zone. This is from a guy called Otto Scharmer. I'll upload his mini ebook called Theory U. And he talks about 4 levels of listening. The first 2, downloading and factual object-based, listening 1 and listening 2, are all narrative, and they drive your red zone. So that's basically downloading. I see Craig walking down the corridor. Sorry, Craig, you're there, I know. And I think to myself, oh, here we go again. So that's before he even's with me. And when I'm listening to him and he's telling me about his problems, same thing. I'm thinking, that's from the very much the red zone. When I'm trying to interpret your problem and give you a solution, that's that second level. It's a bit better. But when I'm in this deep listening, I'm actually in a space where I'm not doing any thinking whatsoever. I've got a quiet mind, and I'm just observing you. I'm observing what you're saying, the content, the inflection, the pitch, the emotion, the expressions on your face. I'm actually and I can say things like, so this is about confidence, isn't it? So I can throw a question back. I'm not saying you're not confident. So that's in that space, I'm actually in empathic listening. And then even deeper again, when you get in that space with one other person and you forget time altogether and you come up with wonderful new ideas and you're not waiting for the other person to finish because it's your turn to speak, stuff just happens between you. That's the magic place called generative. And that's those two spaces, a very blue zone. That requires someone who has already got an activated and well-built blue zone system. How am I going for time? Cool. So I'm going to skip past this because that's a slide I knew I would have to, and I can build that through. Ladder of inference is something to work through, by the way. That was that previous slide. Have any of you heard the ladder of inference at all? One. So the ladder of inference is connected with all this, and it's worth following up and looking at. This will explain what adolescent kids do. What they'll do is they'll observe an experience, they'll select data out of it. Oh, that person turned around and looked away. That means, that means that I'm on the outer. The assumption is that I'm no longer friends with them. The conclusion, I'm no good. Therefore, I adopt a belief that it drives a sense that I'm not worthy of other people. And then I take actions that might lead to, you can see that ladder of inference? So very much that interpretive meaning stuff that goes on. We do that as people all of the time. And it starts with selecting data and adding meaning. That's a very red zone space. In the blue zone, you can observe. You might select a bit of data, but you take actions based on your observation. All of this sort of red zone interpretation thinking stuff. I've had some really big decisions around some things we have to do about the next 2 years in terms of housing and bringing a dog over. And a lot of the time, I just observe what my brain's doing and even just park the question overnight and allow my brain. You can be quite relaxed, but let your brain do what the brain will do normally without going into all this stuff. So that's worth looking up in terms of what young kids are doing and what they need from you. And how they get to this spot here is through two pathways. One is through modelling, and the second is explicit education. To say, hey, by the way, that's what you're doing. You show this model and teach that model. And then you can teach them other ways of moving forward. It's where mindfulness, as a technique of teaching kids from young ages all the way through to HSC kids and beyond, is a very powerful tool for engaging these creative parts of the brain, the blue zone parts of the brain. So the four competencies then that you need to have up front to start with as leaders of particularly adolescents, mindfulness is the big one. The more mindful you are, this is actually, if we take it down to one other level, at the moment you're choosing to spend your attention on me right now. So at the end of the day, it's about discretionary spend of attention as a resource. Think of it like money. Now, if something weird goes on, I lose your attention. If there's a big sound that goes on in the back, you'll stop or turn around. Your attention gets spent on the urgent and the subconscious. But when you are aware of where your attention's going, that's how you drive a shift between blue and red zone. So for kids, we have to actually almost teach that as well as allow them to practice that. Unconditionality is another blue zone piece, and that comes from the blue zone. So accepting whatever we see, and the best teachers from the Group 8 research that is at the end of this piece they won't be able to reference, shows that being unconditional and being a good listener, if you do those two things, you are transformational. You don't have favourites, you don't ignore people, you deal with things as they, and that can be unconditionality for people and unconditionality for circumstances. Just dealing with whatever comes up. Another great example of unconditionality today. So listening is critical, and the ability to ask good questions. So to wrap up then, I've given you a dump of really, really big ideas. That's the Group 8 research that I referenced. That's what kids need. After 14 years, we've said, what do you need from school? And you can see safety. I need to be in the blue zone. And those three in the middle. And then I need to know, this is in order, that I need to know my teacher has the right skills. We focus on giving the right skill sets from a pedagogical point of view, but you get far more bang for buck when you actually make sure they're ticked off to begin with. The last point around that slide is that what happens if you give kids those things? What they say is, I have greater confidence. If someone has greater confidence, they're actually saying, you've shifted my blood flow to here. Confidence moves to creativity, it moves to collaboration. I have greater respect for the teacher, and here's the kicker. When you really are presenting yourself as a strong blue zone teacher, you'll get kids, and I can tell from the way you are as a person, you'll have kids that will walk over hot coals for you, and you'll know the best teachers because that's what they do. They will go their way not to let their teacher down. This works in footy clubs, this works in families, this works in the corporate world, and it's because it comes from the listening and the unconditionality. Those two elements drive that all together. So the last few things are pieces that you can look up in your own time. SCARF is definitely worth looking at. That's something that kids need to have to be in this safe spot, this safe space, and that's all neuroscientifically driven. So there's a nice article in iTunes that can reference that for you. It's a really good framework to check the way you manage behaviour in a school. And in our lower elementary and upper elementary, we're using SCARF, Blue Zone, Red Zone, and I always forget the name of it, restorative justice, restorative practice, sorry. They all interconnect, and this sort of, if you can tick off all of those, you know things are working. So they're the last things to work with. The last thing I'm going to leave you with is how you can start to perhaps explore your own ability to stay calm under pressure. And just my last little secret, what I tend to do, I've got really good earphones. When I go home, I'll walk. You said about the prize for going the least distance here in Singapore. I actually live about 1k away, so a lot of us are like that. So I've travelled virtually nowhere. But when I walk home, I put music that engages me emotionally, which could be like film set music. So it's something that could be filmic or scenic, if you like. I call it soundtracking. And all of a sudden, I stop thinking about stuff at school and I start seeing stuff as if it's a movie. And I see the way a bird just flutters behind some trees. I see the flash of light on a car going past. And I spend 10 or 15 minutes every day walking home in this state, just engaging with this lovely music, but seeing stuff as if it's a movie. And that to me is my little 10 minutes of mindfulness regularly on the way home, that I don't have to lie down because I'm too busy, my brain's going left, right and centre. But it's my little bit of mindfulness. Because I do it every day, a little bit every day, engineers that result. So hopefully I've sparked some interest to explore this further. Hopefully I haven't gone too long over time, and hopefully we have technology not triggering too many red zones. One last little hint, don't tell someone else that they're in their red zone. Doesn't work. So thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Hope that helps.
Look, Andrew, thank you very much. You've given us a lot to digest and think about. I think it's something that can be applied to, I was sitting there really applying it to managing adults as well. I think a lot of the same things apply, so we do appreciate it. Please accept this gift from the association.
Thank you.
Let's get into another clap to say thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your lunch.
It is lunchtime now, so we're heading back to where we had morning tea. We'll look at the posters, some of our presenters.